Do y'all see that?
Yes.
Okay.
End of the world.
Yeah, and let's take a straw poll here with the four of us. Who thinks Revelation's about the end of the world?
Yes, the world, but not life.
Right. Well, that's an important distinction. It's the end of something.
That would be why I would say the end of the world is a semantic discussion, because what world are we talking about?
Yeah. That's going to play big into our discussions in the months to come.
If you're a believer of the king,
symbolism, I didn't understand. And so I gave up on it.
well, I spent much of my life, as we'll discuss here in a little bit, believing that Revelation was about the end of the world. And I did have an awareness there was to be more life after the fact in some fashion. But it definitely as a child, it didn't come across that way. So we'll talk more about that in a little bit. Our agenda for tonight is introductory words. We're going to share our Revelation stories, meaning share what our interactions have been like with the book of Revelation, what our relationship has been like to this book, memories associated with this book. And then I'm going to move on to my goal for this class, which I'll clearly state up front. And then I'll give us an overview of the course. And that will be all for tonight. Sue, you asked what translation will be going from. We're going to lay 3 classes of groundwork before we move in through the book of Revelation, which we'll get when I show you the schedule. It'll all become clear. But before we dive in, I just want to acknowledge up front that the book of Revelation does stir up strong feelings and very specific interpretive approaches. And I mean very specific. You might have 2 people in the same room who believe nearly everything the same, except for maybe one component part, and they might argue about that for the rest of their lives. And I'm personally aware of one church community that has become very strained because its members cannot arrive at a shared understanding of Bible prophecy. I don't know if you've ever met a church community like that, or have known family members who perhaps it was difficult to speak to, or a friend. This being said, I expect that we will share different opinions and approaches to these topics. So we should commit from the onset to treat one another with respect. And I don't expect to have many problems in this regard. I know you all, but it should be said up front. And I want to also say that I own that challenge as well for myself. I realize coming as the teacher and the pastor, it can be felt that my word is the authoritative word that will trump all others. I will do my best to allow as much room and space for divergent opinions and discussions. I will also say what I think it is, what I think as well, but that's what I'm here for. But now, the book of Revelation. Dragons and beasts, multi-headed monsters, locusts the size of horses, great battle so ferocious that the blood of the slain rises as high as the horses' chins. These are truly terrible scenes to behold, but these scenes of over-the-top violence and calamity are punctuated by scenes of splendor and great beauty. Angelic hosts sing hymns of praise. Gold and light flood the holy city of God where Jesus is enthroned. All nations flood through the holy city's wide open gates so that they may be reconciled, so that death and sin will be no more. These are scenes of both terror and joy. The book of Revelation has incited both of these responses. Our Revelation story. The book of Revelation has been quite a polarizing book. Some of us absolutely love it. Some find it terrifying and avoid it at all costs. Still others find it more confusing than anything. As a pastor, I've been met with a wide range of reactions to the book through the years. I've been met with wide-eyed individuals who volunteered their opinions about the book, about Bible prophecy, and where we might be on the timeline. But just as often, I've been met with people who seem genuinely troubled by the book, sincere Christians who find the imagery and violence of Revelation troubling. I have been both of these individuals in my time in life. I have approached this book with both fascination and terror, depending on when you asked me. So let's take a moment to tell our own Revelation stories. And if you don't feel comfortable, of course, you don't have to, but I was wondering if anybody would like to share what their own experiences of this book have been like.
mean, how we've studied it, or
what comes to mind, what you're, for example, the Gospel of Luke specifically is very important to me, and it's been my favorite to study. And I have I could describe the relationship I've had with that book. I'll tell my Revelation story here in a little bit, but what I've learned is that, well, what I've gathered is that our stories about Revelation and our relationship to the book vary from individual to individual. And some people come away with, it's their favorite book. They can't get enough of it. They want more of it. Give me more. And others, maybe faithful church-going Christians, maybe haven't read the book in years, for the opposite reasons. They find it overwhelming, scary, and don't know quite what to make of it, quite honestly, especially when there are people, the loudest voices, it would seem, in the media and in the culture that do comment on it, paint a picture like it's all doom and gloom. That's why the apocalypse has come to mean end of the world, which we'll find in a little bit. I'm sure something you may already know. It doesn't, but that's more what I mean, Sue. About what your relationship.
I think it's the completion of the covenant that God's made with the Gentiles. He's told us what's going to happen. He says the Messiah is coming, and the Messiah is going to save us, and this is how it's going to happen. And I want everybody to have the possibility to come over to worship the Lord, to worship Him, and that requires different ways to do that. I mean, when the Israelites were bad people, Babylon came in and took them out. And then eventually, they were scattered all over the world because they weren't doing what they were supposed to be doing. They didn't obey God or even worship Him. So this is a completion to the story that was started back in Genesis.
Got it.
I'm thinking about it, and I can't ever remember studying much about Revelation, at least in the church. I can't remember sermons about it. I can't remember Sunday school materials about it. Maybe we just avoid talking about it. At least that's my sense, because I can't ever remember a study about it. I can't remember. Certainly, you don't do children's lessons on it.
You wait. I can tell you some stories.
So I think maybe we avoid talking about it.
I hear that a lot. I hear both. I hear both rapt fascination, where it's like somebody can't put it down, and then also what you said, where it's almost like it exists, but no one really talks about it. And in my church growing up, I was one of those churches where they were very, very focused on it, on at least Bible prophecy and the end of times and all that sort of thing. But we also never did. Now that you mention it, Nancy, I don't recall a concerted study on it in church. And I would suspect that, if I had to guess why that might be the case, especially with the community's interest in it, is I have a feeling that the pastor kind of knew, or the pastors kind of knew, that it would be opening a can of worms that would be quite contentious. Just opinions on it vary, and some people feel quite strongly.
I studied in BSF, I don't know, 3 or 4 years ago now, but
okay.
How much that I will remember, I have no idea. And in fact, I'm studying it right now with another Bible study group. And the way I'm studying, it's totally different. For one thing, what was it? Was it the churches? There's I forget now even that part. Anyway, they talk about these time frames are applicable to different time frames in that we've gone through. And now we're in the last of the time frames. Started in 1900s, I think. So, yeah.
There's a word, a fancy word that we won't really get into today, but we will in the future, which is called dispensation. And each of those time frames are known. Is that a word that's familiar?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's the, yeah. So, and talk about different opinions. One of the reasons probably it talked about even churches that are very interested in it is I am aware in my home church of very different opinions about those dispensations. I can picture right now individuals that I know because of my upbringing in that church where they stand. My father's one of them. And even if you agree that there are dispensations, meaning periods in history where God moves us into a new era of transformation or struggle, even in that, there's quite a lot of different opinions. Well, here's my revelation story, and you will be aware of some of it, I'm sure, as you've known me through the years. But I had thought I was raised in a church that was very preoccupied with the end times, and I think that now I see that I was only as preoccupied as any other Protestant evangelical congregation, which is to say, they basically thought of the book of Revelation as a book that forecasts the future, and that overall schema was pretty well settled. Basically left behind style dispensationalist theology. And we'll cover all of this as we roll along. As I was saying, I used to think that my church was very preoccupied with the end times, and perhaps they were, but I now realize that it was my father who is most fixated on these things. Growing up, the end of days were always just around the corner. However, my father believed that this would occur, that before this would occur, Christians would need to endure great suffering before we were saved and collected to earth with God, away from the tribulations of this earth. That's what you would call a belief in a post-tribulation rapture. We'll get to that again in the weeks to come. So we waited and we prepared. We watched the news with rapt interest, looking for signs of the end times, trying to determine just where we were on the eschatological timeline. Eschatology, by the way, is about doctrines pertaining to the culmination of God's plans, or the end times, as some will insist. All of this terrified me as a child. And I was told, and I sincerely believed, that very soon my family would suffer and endure great persecution because of their faith, because of our faith. I was told that we would need to head for the hills when the signs of the times indicated that we were nearly at Earth's terminus. The two stories quickly. One is my mom found out when I was, I must have been in 5th grade or something like that. She had found out that he was making calls to Alaska, to some realtor in Alaska, scoping property, because he had heard that you didn't pay property taxes there. So his idea was he was going to buy property in the middle of nowhere in Alaska, where we would kind of hole up and wait out the end times. And my mom told him, "You can do that, Dennis, but you're not going to bring the kids." And so that kind of put an end to that. Other story that sticks out as I'm thinking of these things is about Y2K. You may remember the news at the time about the turn of the century, and how something about the way the computers were coded, they wouldn't be able to compensate for the dates or something, I don't know. But it spun out into a lot of different conspiracy theories, and one of those was that it would line up with the biblical timeline at the end. And so we bought, it's still at my parents' house, a cabinet that they stocked with canned goods. I remember filling up all the bathtubs with water and anything that could hold water, in anticipation that we were about to go through a quite trying time. As I said, this all left me terrified. I was told that in the end, all would be good, but the build up until that end, wars and rumors of wars, earthquakes and natural disasters, violence and bloodshed. I can remember more than one evening where my father read descriptions from the Bible of the violence and hardships that were just around the corner, waiting for us. I remember begging him to stop reading, but he plowed along ahead, believing he was doing right by his son, to warn him of the calamity to come. I can remember going to bed after evening devotions, clutching my children's Bible close to my chest, crying and praying, begging Jesus not to come back in my lifetime. After all, I wanted to enjoy the good things I had expected to enjoy when I grew up. I wanted to get married, have kids, and grow old. So I'd plead with the good Lord to delay his return. But I couldn't live that way forever, at least not all the time. So I took my fears and anxiety about Revelation and Bible prophecy, and I more or less tabled them, similar to what you were talking about, Nancy, how people didn't really talk. I went through a long period of my life, maybe 10 years, even some of these years as a pastor in my last church, where I more or less tabled this discussion, not quite knowing what to do. I set the book aside as something to worry about at another time. I avoided the book of Revelation except for the first 3 chapters, which even today on the radio, on the AM radio, I heard a preacher preaching on the church in Laodicea. So sometimes we'll have sermons from the first 3 chapters, specifically the first 2, second and third rather, that deal with those 7 churches and the different problems with them. But aside from that, I avoided it, assuming it to be either too incomprehensible for my understanding and too stressful to seriously consider. Throughout my pastorate, I have learned that my feelings are by no means unique or rare. I've met many Christians who are confused by and or scared of the book of Revelation. I've also met perhaps just as many who are downright enthused by the whole thing, especially over the questions as to where we are on the prophetic timeline. For much of my time as pastor, I didn't really know what to say or how to contribute to these conversations on account of my own baggage. So I largely avoided the conversation. I felt a bit uneasy about this, and I am a pastor after all, but I just didn't know how to engage these topics. I was carrying baggage and largely unable to help others with their own, except to commiserate. Here's my goal for this study. And I'll bring this up now and again as needed. But my goal for this study and my time with you over the course of these next 2.5 months is to teach you what I've learned since then about the book of Revelation, how it was originally understood when it was first read, how it has been read through the centuries, because it hasn't always been read in the way that it's approached today. Today, there have been at different times unique, idiosyncratic ways of approaching it, specific to those times and contexts in history. But ultimately, I hope to demonstrate how this book is not a book of terror, but is rather a book that calls us to a radical hope. Don't believe me? Stay tuned. I think we may all get there together. So this will be a study in 3 parts. So Sue, you asked what Bible I'll be reading from. Bring whatever one you prefer. But this will be a study in 3 parts. Today is the introduction. Next week, we will move into learning about apocalyptic literature and Jewish history, because the style and genre of the book of Revelation itself did not happen in a vacuum. You may have noticed that it reads like the 7th chapter of Daniel. That's because 7th chapter of Daniel is part of that same genre of apocalyptic literature that was being written in the centuries building up to the time of Jesus and in the early church. And this is reflected. Pardon?
I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Okay. This is reflected in not only some of the apocalyptic material in our own Old Testament or Hebrew Bible. There's some pseudo apocalyptic language and like the prophets of Jeremiah and Isaiah, and we'll talk some more about those things. But then there are some passages, like I mentioned, Daniel chapter 7, that are just, they read like the way Revelation reads. In fact, I had, as a child, little playing card collectibles that had some of the creatures that were mentioned in Daniel chapter 7. I had these on little cards, little trading cards as a kid. Got them at the Bible bookstore at church camp. But then after we've talked about apocalyptic literature in Jewish history, and then set the groundwork in the next class, or 2 weeks from now, about the writing of it itself, who wrote it, and the time and era in which it was written, but then we will move on to the book of Revelation itself, and we will spend. I'll show you the schedule here in a little bit, but about 2 months going through the book, not exactly chapter by chapter, but systematically. Then in the last, I believe it is 3 classes, this is putting us all the way in January, the month of January. We're going to talk about Revelation in the centuries after its writing. How did somebody in the year 500 approach this book? What did people make of this book during the Middle Ages, or during the bubonic plague, or I mean, some of you may remember what people thought of it during during World War II. But probably not actually. Now that I'm thinking about that, but during World War II and other eras in history, turn of the 20th century, people have had hot takes on Revelation and been utterly convinced and sincere, and have been, in retrospect, sincerely wrong. But we'll talk about all those things. First part, apocalypse in Jewish history, first used in the Bible. It comes from a Greek word, apocalypse, which quite literally means disclosure. And it's something you may have already been told. It's kind of one of those little facts that pastors keep in their back pocket to bring out as an anecdote. But that's what it means. It does not mean end of the world. The reason why it's called the Book of Revelation in our language is because the word apocalypsis means something more like Revelation does, a book, something that reveals something that's hidden. In this case, hidden about God and God's purposes. So, important point before we even get really into it: in the Bible, apocalypse does not mean the end. And the reason why we believe that it does mean the end is because we have been convinced that Bible prophecy forecasts the world's end. And so that's why we think of it that way. But it's not very helpful, actually, because that's not what it in fact means. But the apocalyptic prophetic traditions in the Hebrew Bible, while ours tend to be focused on the end of times as people conceptualize it today, as we'll see next week, the apocalyptic prophetic traditions in the Hebrew Bible were not concerned about the end of days. Rather, they were concerned with the goings-ons of their own time and day. They would describe the way things were in the world with all of its violence, suffering, and injustice. And then they would write in powerfully descriptive and poetic language of how God felt about the way of things. Sometimes they would then describe a hopeful vision for a possible future that should the people and nations find their way to repent and change their ways. The prophets were unwilling to accept the status quo, which is why they wrote. As the apocalyptic traditions developed, the writers began to frame their struggles in terms of a cosmic conflict between the forces of good and of evil. We can actually see, as an aside here, we can actually see in the literature the development of this idea in Judaism, as it was in all likelihood influenced by Zoroastrianism in the Persian Empire, which had taken over at that time. They hold a dualistic worldview between forces of light and darkness, good and evil, and that became woven into Jewish and then later Christian theology and other theologies of other groups in the area. And the prophets would write in such a way as to give form and shape to the struggles they saw around them, the evil empires of the day that they would describe as wild beasts and other colorful descriptions, many of which the people in their day would understand and readily grasp immediately, kind of the way we understand political cartoons in our own time. You see a picture of an elephant and a donkey, and you know we're talking politics, right? There were shorthand descriptions, images back then that function in the same way. And in apocalyptic literature, we find these sorts of things, images that the people in the area would understand what they were standing for, what they were symbolic of. Sometimes the evil empire under consideration would be Egypt, other times Persia, but the name that stuck as the stand-in for all things imperialistic was Babylon. And make no mistake, that is why we have in Revelation, Babylon, again, Babylon by the time Revelation is written, is a byword, right? That empire is no longer in a sense, but Babylon is continued to use because of the Jewish apocalyptic literature and its focus on Babylon as not so much even a nation state anymore, but as a symbol for all that is broken and wrong in humanity as manifest in the practices of the Babylonian Empire of that day, as experienced by the Jewish exiles. The writer of Revelation drew from these earlier prophetic writings. For example, the seraphs in the throne room mentioned by the prophet in Isaiah chapter 6 are echoed, if not in some ways mirrored, in the description of the heavenly throne room in Revelation 4. So all this to say, the book of Revelation comes out of a larger prophetic tradition that, at the time of its writing, was already more than half a century old. So keep that in mind as we progress forward with our modern interpretations, the 21st century, that we are in many ways, without understanding this background, this context that goes back hundreds of years, it's like trying to, I guess it would be like picking up a modern political cartoon with no context, right? And to say you came into to our space and time from the past or from the future, and you didn't know, and somebody handed you these pictures of a donkey and of an elephant, you would think maybe they were talking literally about donkeys and elephants that were anthropomorphized and talked, and you might come up with some pretty wacky ideas about what was being signified in the political cartoon, unless you understood the background. And that takes time, which is why we're progressing in the way that we are here. As I said, part 2 of the class, starting in 3 weeks, we'll spend several weeks going over the book itself, and we'll consider its authorship, its immediate context, and the actual content of the book. And we'll discuss what this meant for its original readers, and how the imagery and metaphors found there pertained to the events transpiring around the original readers. And so what I hope you'll come to see is that the images and descriptions found in Revelation, in fact, describe events that had already transpired in history, as well as events transpiring in their present. Does the book tell the future, as many assume? No spoilers. We'll cross that bridge when it comes. Sorry, but I don't want to jump the gun. Then the last part, again, will be in January at this point. We're going to talk about Revelation through the centuries. And I think this is where it's going to get, it's going to be exciting, I think, throughout. But this part, I think, especially will be exciting for those of us who may have assumed that the ways it has been presented in our time are not only the only ways, but are old ways. The way that Revelation is approached in modern times by just about nearly everyone, aside from in seminaries and in like robust biblical scholarship, like think popular culture, think Left Behind movies, think Nicolas Cage or Kirk Cameron, whichever you like the best. But that is the most dominant way to view these, and many people believe that only is it the default, but is the way. Well, we're going to talk about how Revelation has been not only interpreted in that Left Behind sense in modern times, but it has gone through chapters and stories where people have in confidence taken it and used it in their own time, and sincerely so for and doing the best they could. But we'll talk about that. Now to our pending schedule. Tonight, the introduction. Had to push it back a week because I was sick. Thank you and apologies for that. And the next week, Apocalypse in Jewish Literature. Then the next week, the origins of Revelation, which will be, the writer, the authorship, the time of its composition, and what was going on in that time. And then November 1st, we will begin getting into the book proper. And you see, we're going to take it on in chunks that have to do with themes. So each of these chunks portrays a specific, not only theme, but a scene in the heavenly throne room or near and around, and or on earth. And we'll take each one and we'll talk about the symbolism there and the original meaning and its possible meanings for us today. No class the week of Thanksgiving. Mark your calendars. Then we have, we're taking 3 weeks off in late December, early January. I'm calling it Christmas break, but it goes on into the new year. So for 3 weeks, the 27th, the 3rd, and the 10th, we're going to take a break. And then we'll conclude our study of the book proper with the very end of the book, The Revelator Wakes Up. And then we will take a class on the centuries that followed. And then in the last class, we'll bring it up to our present time and try to put a bookend on it. Until then, I will send this reading list out to you, but I have put together a reading list, which I say I put together a reading list. It really is more the reading list I inherited from my professor, for Dr. Ron Allen, who taught the course that I took in seminary. But these are the books that I have primarily leaned on for this presentation. Some online articles and other things as well. But also I owe a great debt of gratitude to what you see listed at the bottom of this slide. A Great Courses lecture series, which is a college lecture series by the Great Courses, called The Apocalypse, Controversies and Meaning in Western History, done by Professor Craig R. Koester. It's a 24-part series, each a half hour long. And I have watched it twice in preparation for this, but it's very good. In fact, as I watched it, I was thinking to myself, this is what I really want to be doing, and I should just show this for people. But I feel I wouldn't be doing my job to be copying out. So I'm going to do the best I can with my abilities. But if you want it done much better, check that out. I got it at the local library, the IPS library. If you see it's on a waiting list, it's probably because I have it right now. But you might put yourself in the queue. And I also have a longer reading list of commentaries and other things that not all that I've used from, but you might consider. A disclaimer: I am not a Bible scholar. I'm a pastor who has been taught the rudimentary skills of what Bible scholars do, and I have some tricks and some interpretations and things that I've been taught. Some skill sets. But I will get some things wrong, I'm sure. In fact, I'm sure you will pose questions to me at some point that I don't know the answer to, or I might find an answer in the moment, believing it to be correct, only to find later that I didn't know what I was talking about. So I'm just putting that disclaimer out there, not to say put up with anything, but just to say I'm entering into this with some humility here. It's quite a big thing to tackle, and I expect to find myself in over my head a few moments throughout the course of these months together. That being said, I'll turn it over for questions that you might have. Any questions you might have?
So the apocalyptic literature in the Old Testament is just disclosure literature. Is that right?
Yeah, apocalypse means disclosure, and when they wrote, they were trying to disclose the purposes and intentions of God. That's the meaning of the word literally, and that's why when John the Revelator writes uses the word in the Greek, that's what he's talking about. He's writing in that tradition. It's like writing in the style and in tradition of the apocalyptic writers. So it was a distinct genre within Judaism, and in the Greek culture started writing in apocalyptic literature too. When you go to Wikipedia, it's a good one-stop shop for just a cursory overview of these things, and you just type in apocalyptic literature in Wikipedia, and you'll find a list of the apocalyptic literature in the Hebrew Bible, our Old Testament. You'll find a list of apocalyptic literature that is not canonical but was around in the first, second, third centuries BCE. Then you will find a list of apocalyptic literature that is in the Christian canon, and then also in Christian apocalyptic, I should say, not apocryphal, apocalyptic literature that's in the Christian canon. And then if you really do some digging, you can find some that is in Greek culture and Roman culture. It wasn't even within Judaism or Christianity, the same genre, but utilized in a different sphere. I don't know if that answered your question.
Sure.
Well, did it really? Because I'd hate to string you along.
Well, I mean, I wasn't aware that there was such a thing as apocalyptic literature in the Old Testament. So there you go.
Yeah. Okay. Well,
Ezekiel's got a lot, right?
yes, it does. Yes, that's one of the
Ezekiel's got it.
wheels with wheels and wheels. I also had a biblical card with that too. I had a card, these little I tried to find them. I could find where you could buy them on eBay as collectors, but I couldn't find like a proper pack where you could buy these cards. So I'm actually, next time I go home, there's a few places in like those stowaway places where Mom kept some of the things we had that I think I'm wondering if they're not there. If I can find them, I'll bring them to show you all.
I mean, wasn't there a whole series of books called Left Behind?
Yeah, well, yes. So written by,
I read one of them in our book club.
oh wow.
I can remember
Well,
as they
one of the books I suggested,
and everybody disappeared. Except
one of the books I read that as a child. One of the books I suggested is by James. I don't know if you can see me here. Are you seeing me in your screen right now?
Just a little square right in the bottom.
Little square. Here, I'm going to stop the sharing.
There you go.
This book says Left Behind, what the Bible really says about the end times. And I like this book because it's short and it's succinct, and it doesn't try to be more than it doesn't try to be like it positions itself as a very overview, what you need to know in 100 pages by James Efford.
Yeah.
And it's a good book.
And
The Left Behind series added a lot of to make it a story, like as opposed to
It was the
facts.
novelization of the Book of Revelation.
Yeah, there you go.
Well,
The
it was
fictional
written also
novelization.
by Timothy LaHaye and Jerry B. Jenkins. By the way, just let me show you something I found today.
Oh, he's
Milling
excited.
about the library here,
I found it.
and I found a Tim LaHaye book from 1968 that is not about Revelation at all. It's just about marriage. That was so. But he wrote Tim LaHaye. If it's the same Tim LaHaye, wrote the Left Behind series with a sports writer, Jerry B. Jenkins, and I'm personal friends with his second cousin. And Jerry B. Jenkins had written autobiographies and biographies about not autobiographies, biographies about different sports stars and different topics related to sports. And then he was commissioned by Timothy LaHaye to I don't know if we would call it ghostwrite, but co-write with him to fit his system that he. We'll talk a lot about that. We'll talk a lot about. I have opinions about it, and we'll get to that. I don't want to jump the gun, but yeah, we'll get there.
What about these people who come to your door and say they've decided that on, October 10th or whatever, that the world is coming to an end, and they've got that.
They are.
Jesus told us nobody knows when the world would end.
But
Even
there's-
Jesus said he didn't know when he was on earth when the world would end. So just say bye. You don't know what you're talking about.
They often are. You could probably bet that they're sincere. Sometimes when the prophecies fail, they will apologize. And Family Radio in Florida, what was his name? There was a fellow at a big radio station called Family Radio. He's dead now, but he had. I should look this up, but he had made a Bible prophecy based on numbers that he had calculated and had an end date. And people associated with his ministry sold their homes, cashed in, used it all to buy buses and billboards and go over there in the country telling people at the end of the world. And then it happened. And then it did not happen. The day came and went. We're obviously still here. And then they recalibrated, which is pretty standard. They'll usually go back and say, whether we're talking about George Miller and the Millerites in the 1800s, which we'll talk about later in this series, or anyone in modern times, they'll usually recalibrate and find a different date. And then if that doesn't pan out, they may say something like, it spiritually happened, but not the way we expected. But it happened, and we were right. But Harold Camping is the name of the guy in Florida. Harold Camping admitted he was wrong. Now, after that, people had their lives ruined, etc. But he did admit he was wrong and say, I'll never make another Bible prophecy again. I'll never predict again. He basically shuttered his ministry, but he was like 90 at that point. So if somebody comes to your door, treat them kindly.
Why is it important for people to come up with a date that's going to be the end of time?
Well, first off, they believe that's what is being asked of them by the texts themselves. They believe that the texts present them with a timeline that once you decipher it correctly, you will know. So it comes from that sincere belief from the onset. And if that were true, and if God were going to end the world and really and bring a final conclusion to our lives and how you had lived up to that point, what you believed, determined what would happen to you, then if you were a person like the person knocking on your door who believed those things, and they would feel it very important to let you know, with the mindset being they might save your life in that way. Sometimes they do it because they expect to be rejected, but they have to do it because they believe God has asked them to. So if they believe they're part of a remnant that's not, that's pretty settled, a pretty small community, they might still evangelize, but have no expectation that anyone will come around. I'm thinking here of like the Westbrook Baptist Church, who did talk about the end times amongst many other things. in Topeka, Kansas, and they did not believe, they had no delusions that anybody was going to convert to their belief system. They just believed that that's what God needed them to do, to be loud.
Do you think they
and
do it to get people to repent and come to Christ?
I think the Westboro Baptist, they're all lawyers. From the patriarch who has been disaffiliated, he may be dead now, Fred Phelps. But they're all lawyers, and they've made a lot of money suing people because they know the law and they know what they can do to offend at funerals and what others cannot do. So I also think they sincerely believe, but they think that they are the only church on the planet. So they don't think any of us have much hope. But they're also mysteriously, strangely compelled by God to also preach, although there are occasionally people who will join a church like that. One documentary I saw about that church was made by a man who was a journalist who went there to document them and converted. Another documentary I saw involved a young man who sat at the back, who was not allowed to join the church, but believed it was the only church where you could be saved, and sat in great anxiety because he was not allowed to join the church for whatever reason, but believed he was going to hell, but believed he was sitting as closely proximate to the place where he could find salvation should they let him in.
Isn't there only one place in the Bible that talks about this future event, and that's when Jesus said, when you see the leaves blooming, you'll know that the time is coming, and that's the only time. And so now we wait because the leaves have blossomed.
We will talk about that. Are you talking about the parable of the fig tree?
Yep.
We will talk about those things when we get to the apocalyptic literature in the Christian scriptures.
And have you ever thought about the 2,000 years? You got your Abraham, 2,000 years, you got Jesus, and now we've got 2,000 years. And God's a God of order. So.
Oh, there you are. I know what you're talking about. I'm familiar.
Yeah.
You raised me as a son. Still think God's a God of order. You're so precious. I know.
No, that's why Y2K was such an appealing option for someone like my dad, because of the symmetry.
Yeah.
It's very. But
I
keep these thoughts. Oh, sorry, Jay. What were you
well, when I was a child, I wanted to decipher the book of Revelations. So I would, God told me what was going to be in the future, and then that would give me,
knowledge.
Well, everything,
like
right? It's almost like, I'll understand the prophecies of the Bible. I can manipulate things, and I can be, it provides emotional security that a child doesn't have. It provides adult, you'd be an adult, right? If you could understand these books, even adults would listen to you and stuff like that. Wow. So I think there's a huge emotional security factor to this. And then if you get to tell everybody else what's going to happen, and when you take the end of the world spin on it, it's in the form of a threat. It has
an endpoint that you'd better hop on board.
Right. Well, believe what I believe or else.
Yeah.
And I've studied the book twice. I studied it in Sunday school, in high school. Lynn Cohey went through it with us one time.
Yeah.
And then we went to 7th and 8th.
Yes.
Way back in the day.
Yeah.
Long before we were attending there, when we were still at Augusta. I think Bill Rowland was still here, so I would have still been in high school.
Yeah.
And that was when I was first introduced to the amillennialists out there who don't think we're either in the millennium or it's already happened or it's not gonna happen. Well, anyway, as I've grown up, the book says at the end of it, don't add anything or take anything away from the book.
Right.
And particularly when the Left Behind series came out and someone made an entire fictional story behind what I now would call their confirmation bias about good people and bad people.
The plane scenes in both movies. From looking at them who's gonna get taken and who's not. Right. You can just tell by just looking at them.
I haven't seen the movies. I've avoided that whole thing because I find it a little distasteful because of those verses at the end. I think the fourth from the last and the third from the last that say, "Don't mess with this book." And so my walk away from it is the purpose of this book is to say God has a plan and you don't understand it. Move on. And if you have faith and if you have a relationship with God, you're like, that's good enough. I don't need to understand. I don't need to understand the plan. And if you don't have faith, I shouldn't say you don't have faith. If your faith is younger and more
immature
and less secure, and then you need God to tell you what the details of the plan are. Because I need to know the plan because I need to know the plan. Yeah. And I think that's the major difference in the way the book gets looked at.
I also think scripture tells us that God is waiting for all of them to come to him. Everyone that's supposed to come to him, he's waiting for that to happen. So this could be a while.
I don't even know what that means.
I have since all I described and all that nightmarish stuff. I love this book now, and I didn't have to change or twist my sense of fairness or rightness or beauty or goodness to get there. In fact, I think by the time we get to the end of it and have a better understanding of the way that apocalyptic literature function, I'm eager and excited to discover what you all think of that as we lay it out, of the system of interpretation as we lay it out. And then at the end, we'll have learned something, and you could take it or leave it. But thank you. That's all I had prepared for tonight. Well, folks, grace and peace to you. I'm going to sign off. I'll see you soon, I hope.
Okay. All right. Bye.
Bye-bye.